Imagine a world shattered, a continent scarred, and the ashes of 6 years of unimaginable horror still settling. World War II had finally ended, but the echoes of its brutality, the stench of its death camps, and the sheer scale of its devastation lingered like a phantom limb. 27 million souls perished in the Soviet Union alone, a seventh of its pre-war population, mostly civilians, victims of an aggression so profound it defied human comprehension. Across Europe, countless more lay buried beneath the rubble of cities and the weight of unspeakable atrocities. The architects of this catastrophe, the high command of Nazi Germany, were now defeated, their regime a smoking ruin. But what justice could possibly fit crimes of this magnitude? How do you hold men accountable for unleashing the accumulated evil of an entire war? This was the question that haunted the victorious Allies in the summer of 1945, a question that would lead to a groundbreaking, controversial, and ultimately historic reckoning: the Nuremberg Trials. The path to Nuremberg was far from clear. As early as 1942, governments in exile from German-occupied Europe cried out for an international court, a demand initially met with skepticism by the United States and the United Kingdom, who remembered the failed war crimes prosecutions after World War I. Ideas for retribution ranged wildly. The Soviet Union, devastated beyond measure, envisioned a show trial, a public condemnation with a predetermined outcome. The British, weary from endless conflict and haunted by the sheer barbarity they had witnessed, leaned towards summary executions, a swift and brutal finality for the Nazi leadership. But the United States, under President Harry S. Truman, held a different vision. They insisted on a trial, one that would be seen as legitimate, a beacon of justice, not just for the victims, but for the future of international law itself. On November 1st, 1943, the Moscow Declaration was issued, a solemn warning from the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States. It declared their intent to pursue them to the uttermost ends of the earth in order that justice may be done. High-ranking Nazis, the declaration stated, would face joint tribunals, while others would be tried where their crimes were committed. This marked a critical step, but the specific form of justice remained elusive. Soviet jurist Aaron Trenin championed a radical new concept: crimes against peace, the act of waging aggressive war itself. This idea, initially met with resistance, would become central to the Allied case, elevating the very act of unprovoked invasion to a criminal offense. Yet, the British still harbored deep reservations about retroactive criminality, the idea of prosecuting someone for an act that wasn't legally defined as a crime at the moment it was committed. The dilemma was profound. How do you apply the rule of law to those who had utterly dismantled it? The debate raged, unresolved even at the Yalta Conference in February 1945. But with Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8th, the war in Europe finally ended, and the need for a decision became urgent. Just days before, at the San Francisco conference drafting the United Nations Charter, President Truman had announced the formation of an international military tribunal. The stage was set, but the script still needed to be written. From June 26th to August 2nd, 1945, representatives from France, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States converged in London. These were not easy negotiations. The very idea of a trial hung in the balance. The British were still wary, the Soviets insistent on a swift, condemnatory process, and the French seeking to highlight the economic plunder and cultural destruction. The London Conference was where the legal framework for this unprecedented trial, the Nuremberg Charter, was painstakingly hammered out. 3 categories of offenses emerged: crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The most contentious was crimes against peace. Was aggressive war truly prohibited by existing international law? American negotiator and Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson, a man of formidable intellect and unwavering resolve, stood firm. He threatened American withdrawal if aggression was not prosecuted, arguing it was the very rationale for their entry into the war. He recognized that prosecuting the act of war itself was essential to preventing future global conflagrations. This was a revolutionary concept, pushing the boundaries of international jurisprudence. War crimes, violations of the laws and customs of war, already existed in international law, but a crucial gap remained. How to prosecute crimes committed by a government against its own citizens? The systematic murder of millions of Jews, Romani, homosexuals, and political dissidents within Germany and its occupied territories demanded a new legal instrument. A Soviet proposal for crimes against civilians was refined by Jackson into crimes against humanity, a term that had seen limited, unsuccessful use after World War I and in attempts to prosecute the Armenian genocide. The final wording, defining murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other inhumane acts committed against any civilian population, was a monumental step forward. However, a compromise was struck. The tribunal's jurisdiction over these crimes was limited to those committed as part of a war of aggression. Both the United States, mindful of its own Jim Crow laws, and the Soviet Union, sensitive to its internal policies, sought to avoid setting a precedent that might expose their domestic affairs to international scrutiny. Perhaps the most profound innovation of the Nuremberg Charter was its assertion of individual responsibility. Traditionally, international law held states accountable, not individuals. Nuremberg shattered this notion, declaring that leaders, not just nations, could be held criminally liable for breaches of international law. Article 7 explicitly prevented defendants from claiming sovereign immunity, and Article 8 stated that acting under superior orders was no valid defense, though it could be a mitigating factor. The trial would be held under a modified common law system, a blend of legal traditions. Nuremberg itself, a city ravaged by Allied bombing, was chosen for its symbolic weight as the former site of massive Nazi rallies. Its relatively intact Palace of Justice, complete with an attached prison, offered a practical and profoundly symbolic venue for this historic confrontation with evil. On August 8th, the Nuremberg Charter was signed in London, and the world braced for a reckoning. By early 1946, 1,000 individuals from the 4 Allied nations descended upon Nuremberg. Lawyers, social scientists, psychologists, translators, interpreters, and even graphic designers all worked feverishly to build the case. Each state appointed a chief prosecutor and 2 judges. Robert H. Jackson, a versatile politician and a remarkable orator, was appointed the United States chief prosecutor. His delegation, the largest, would shoulder the bulk of the immense task. The Americans believed Nazism represented a dangerous deviation from Western civilization, and they sought to correct it through a trial that would serve both retributive and educational purposes. The British chief prosecutor was Hartley Shawcross, assisted by David Maxwell Fyfe. Sir Geoffrey Lawrence, a Lord Justice of Appeal, served as the tribunal's nominal president. France's prosecutor, François de Menthon, had just overseen trials of Vichy France leaders, embodying a nation deeply scarred by occupation and collaboration. He was later replaced by Auguste Champetier de Ribes, a figure from the French resistance, ensuring the prosecution was untainted by the shame of collaboration. The Soviet Union, expecting a show trial, initially appointed Iona Nikitchenko, who had presided over the infamous Moscow trials, but he became a judge, replaced by the orator Roman Rudenko. The Soviet delegation, however, faced constraints, with major decisions requiring approval from Moscow, leading to delays and limiting their influence. Requests from the World Zionist Organization and Poland for active roles in the trial, representing the victims, were ultimately rejected, though Poland did submit evidence drawing attention to the crimes against its Jewish and non-Jewish citizens.
The work of drafting the indictment was a monumental collaborative effort. The British focused on aggressive war, the French on crimes in the Western Front, and the Soviets on the Eastern Front. The American delegation took on the sweeping overall Nazi conspiracy and the criminality of Nazi organizations. This conspiracy charge, a brainchild of U.S. War Department lawyer Murray C. Bernays, was crucial. It allowed the prosecution to connect top Nazi leaders, bureaucrats who may never have personally killed anyone, and even propagandists and industrialists to the broader criminal enterprise. It also helped circumvent the charter's limits on charging crimes committed before the war began. This charge, however, was less popular with the other delegations, particularly France, wary of its novelty. The sheer scale of translating the indictment and evidence into English, French, Russian, and German presented immense logistical hurdles, compounded by the difficulty of recruiting interpreters. Political tensions also simmered beneath the surface. Soviet politician Andrei Vyshinsky demanded extensive corrections to the charges of crimes against peace, particularly regarding the controversial German-Soviet pact. Jackson, too, refined the charges, aiming for the American prosecution to lay out the overarching Nazi conspiracy, while the other delegations filled in the horrific details of specific crimes. This division of labor, combined with the haste of preparation, sometimes led to duplication, imprecise language, and a lack of clear attribution of specific charges to individual defendants. But the sheer volume of material was staggering. The most prominent Nazis, Hitler, Himmler, Goebbels, had cheated justice by committing suicide. So the prosecution aimed for the surviving key leaders across politics, business, and the military. The defendants, largely unrepentant, were a chilling cross-section of the Third Reich's power structure. Former cabinet ministers like Joachim von Ribbentrop and Wilhelm Frick, architects of Nazi foreign policy and internal repression. Economic titans such as Albert Speer, the armaments minister, and Walter Funk, the Reichsbank president, whose ingenuity fueled the war machine. Military leaders like Hermann Goering, the most infamous surviving Nazi, along with Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl, who orchestrated the invasions. Propagandists like Julius Streicher, who spewed vile anti-Semitic venom. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's enigmatic deputy who had flown to Britain in 1941. Hans Frank, the brutal butcher of Poland. And Ernst Kaltenbrunner, chief of the Reich Security Main Office, Himmler's right-hand man in terror. Observers often found them mediocre, even contemptible, a stark contrast to the monstrous crimes they represented. Of the 24 men indicted, Martin Bormann, presumed dead but tried in absentia, and Gustav Krupp, too ill, and Robert Ley, who committed suicide, would not face the tribunal. All other defendants, once masters of Europe, now sat in the dock, each with legal counsel, often former Nazis themselves. Their lawyers challenged the court's jurisdiction, a motion swiftly rejected. Beyond individuals, the Americans also targeted 6 German organizations: the Reich Cabinet, the Leadership Corps of the Nazi Party, the Gestapo, the SA, the SS and the SD, and the General Staff and High Command of the Wehrmacht. The goal was to declare these organizations criminal, streamlining the prosecution of their countless members. The Allies sought to demonstrate that responsibility extended beyond a few top leaders, without condemning the entire German people. Gathering evidence was an immense undertaking. American and British prosecutors prioritized documentary evidence and affidavits over survivor testimony, a strategic choice to bolster credibility against accusations of bias, though it arguably reduced public emotional engagement. They drew on intelligence reports, Jewish research institutes, and captured German documents.
The prosecution sifted through an astounding 110,000 captured German documents, entering 4,600 into evidence, alongside 30 kilometers of film and 25,000 photographs. These were not just dry legal exhibits, they were irrefutable proof of unimaginable horrors. The loose evidentiary rules allowed for photographs, charts, maps, and films to play a crucial role, making the incredible crimes believable. The judges, however, insisted all evidence be read into the record, slowing the proceedings but ensuring meticulous documentation.
On November 20th, 1945, the International Military Tribunal began. All defendants pleaded not guilty. Jackson, in his opening speech, underscored the trial's dual purpose, not merely to convict these men, but to assemble irrefutable evidence of Nazi crimes, establish individual responsibility and the crime of aggression in international law, and offer a history lesson to a defeated Germany. He famously declared it one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. His speech, focusing on aggressive war as the root of all other crimes, was met with widespread acclaim. But the true horror was yet to come. On November 29th, the prosecution, momentarily unprepared to continue on the invasion of Czechoslovakia, instead screened Nazi concentration and prison camps. The film, compiled from footage of the recently liberated death camps, shocked everyone in the courtroom, defendants, judges, and observers alike. The images of emaciated bodies, gas chambers, and mass graves were a stark, undeniable testament to the depths of Nazi depravity. The trial adjourned, the weight of what had been shown too heavy to immediately continue. This moment, more than any legal argument, brought the unimaginable horror into sharp, undeniable focus, forever cementing the Holocaust as the moral core of the Allies' case. This was not just a trial of men. It was a trial of an ideology, a warning to future generations, and the genesis of a new era of international justice.